Hi everyone, my name is Scott Mitchell, and today I'm going to be spending a little bit of time talking to you about shrubs and trees for Oregon bees. Before I get going, I thought I'd tell you a little bit about myself and introduce myself to you. So first off, I'm currently a PhD student at Oregon State University, and I'm studying native bees and other beneficial bugs and other invertebrates. So things like spiders, wasps, all kinds of cool stuff. I also recently completed a master's degree at Oregon State University, where, among other things, I focused on the interactions between native bees and shrubs in northeastern Oregon. Specifically, I worked in the Starkey Experimental Forest and Range and in the Zumwalt Prairie Preserve. Of course, I'm not just a student, so when I'm not studying and working, I do enjoy most of the outdoor activities that Oregon has to offer, and as you'll see in my slides, I do enjoy photography and end up taking quite a few pictures of bees. So an outline of what we'll cover today. Since Oregon has dozens of native shrubs and a few native trees that are useful to our bees, I'll first provide a summary of shrubs and trees in Oregon and the ways that they're useful to bees. Next, I'll walk through a few interesting stories about a few specific shrubs and trees that grow in our state. So first I'll talk about bigleaf maple, which is a common tree in western Oregon. Then I'll talk about willows, which is a diverse group of plants that are widely distributed across the whole state. And then I'll talk about currants, which are one of my favorite types of plants. After that, I'll talk a little bit about snowberries, which are pretty widely distributed across the state. And finally, I'll talk about rabbitbrush, which is an arid lands plant that grows and blooms fairly late in the season and is a dryland shrub that's great to know about. At the end of the talk, I'll give some conclusions and talk about a few other considerations. So a quick summary of shrubs and trees in Oregon. There are, of course, dozens of species, both native and non-native, of shrubs and trees that occur in our state. While many of the non-native species may be useful to some bees, this course will only cover native shrubs and trees. And while I only touch on a few species in this presentation, there's some other materials that I've added to this course that you can look through on your own and explore some of the other species in more detail. There aren't as many native trees that are useful to bees in our state as there are native shrubs, and so that's why there's a little bit more emphasis on shrubs in this presentation and in this portion of the course. Shrubs occur in nearly every part of the state, while our native trees that are useful to bees typically occur mostly on the west side of the state, like bigleaf maple. Shrubs can occur everywhere from deserts to forests. So aside from these, why shrubs and trees? Well, shrubs can provide forage to a diverse array of bees, including some floral specialists, and we'll have more on that later. Shrubs and trees are also long-lived, and oftentimes once they're established can be quite hardy and resilient to varied environmental conditions. Shrubs can also provide a very dense floral resource for bees. As you can see in this picture of a golden currant, there's lots of flowers for the bee to choose from, even though this picture only captures a very small portion of the blooms available on this whole shrub. Mature shrubs and trees can have tens of thousands of blooms, if not hundreds of thousands of blooms when they're in peak bloom. And while smaller flowering plants like forbs are definitely important to include in pollinator habitat, there are not many that can provide as many flowers in as small of a footprint as a shrub or a tree can. Of course, as I mentioned, another benefit to bees is shrubs that can sometimes provide nesting resources for bees, like this elderberry stem that you can see in this slide. Some species of bees will nest in these hollow or pithy stems, or will actively hollow out the pith from a stem and use it to create their nests. And of course, there's other benefits that shrubs and trees can provide. For example, they can provide food for other wildlife. They can provide food for you, because after all, everybody loves huckleberries, both bees and humans. And last, some shrubs just look really pretty and can provide aesthetic value to your landscape. So now we're going to talk about some shrub stories and some interesting case studies having to do with shrubs. So bigleaf maple is probably a tree that you're familiar with if you live on the west side of the state, As you can see in this distribution map, bigleaf maple is mostly restricted to the west side of the state, however it will occasionally grow on the east side of the state. Bigleaf maple is a large tree with large leaves. While bigleaf maple has large leaves and is a pretty big tree, it does have pretty small flowers. As you can see in this photo, the flowers are kind of a greenish color and they're pretty full of pollen, which you can see here on some of the anthers. Bees will pretty readily forage on this pollen, and these blooms will be out in April and May. And it's primarily pollinated by insects, so that means, in our case, bees. What's really neat about this plant is it has a huge number of blooms per tree. Of course, it's a big tree, so that's to be expected, but every branch will produce hundreds if not thousands of blooms. The next plant that we'll talk about is willows, or salix species. This plant is an important early season plant. Like bigleaf maple, it blooms pretty early in the year, and some species will bloom as early as March in our state. Other species will bloom until June. Since willow blooms so early, it does likely support some specialist bees, especially some species of mining bees, or bees in the genus Andrena. Willows are also very diverse in our state, with over 30 species occurring in Oregon. And because the willows are so diverse, willow occurs in every county of Oregon and in most environments. While there's so many species, I've only included 7 species on this range map right here, just to keep things a little simpler. But as you can see, willow is widely distributed across the state and does occur in every county. The next plant that we'll talk about is currants, or plants in the genus Ribes. There's 3 Ribes species in particular that we'll talk about in this portion of the presentation, but all of them are early to mid-season blooming plants. The 3 species that we'll talk about that are best for pollinators in Oregon, you can see pictured here, and they include wax currant on the bottom, red flowering currant that you can see in the middle of the slide, golden currant that you can see on the top of the slide. What's really cool about these plants is they support a diverse community of bees, but they also appear to support some specialist interactions. One of my personal favorite bee-plant interactions is one that occurs with wax currant and a bee called the Pacific digger bee. You can see in this video the Pacific digger bee, or Anthophora pacifica, foraging on wax currant along the Meadow Creek system in Starkey Experimental Forest. What I think is so neat about this interaction is that while we collected over 100 specimens of the Pacific digger bee over 2 years of study using various methods, including different passive traps and hand netting, over 97% of the specimens that we collected were collected foraging on this plant, which seems to indicate some kind of specialist interaction. Interestingly though, this species, Anthophora pacifica, is known to forage on a wide range of plants, so it's possible that it just has a strong preference for wax currant in our system. Of course, wax currants aren't the only important currant for bees, and red flowering currant and golden currant both support diverse populations of bees. And altogether, all 3 species occur across the whole state. Red flowering currant, however, is mostly found in western Oregon, while golden currant is mostly found in eastern Oregon. Wax currant is the most widely distributed of all 3 of these species and occurs widely across the state. The next plant species that we'll talk about today in this presentation is snowberry plants, also known as Symphorocarpus species. These plants are mid to late season blooming and typically start blooming in late June or early July and will bloom until August or even sometimes till the end of August. Now, snowberries are especially loved by bumblebees, but that doesn't mean that these plants don't support a high diversity of bees, and you can in fact find a high variety of bees on these plants. Snowberries are also pretty hardy to drier conditions. All 3 of the species that we have in the state are pretty good at tolerating dry soils and dry conditions. Now, as you can see from this range map, snowberry grows across the state, but most common on the west side is common snowberry, or Symphorocarpus albus. While on the east side of the state, there's 2 other species that occur: desert snowberry, which is Symphorocarpus longiflorus, and mountain snowberry, or Symphorocarpus aureophilus. The next and final plant that we'll talk about in this presentation is rabbitbrush. Now, rabbitbrush is a common name that refers to members of two different genera, which are Ericomeria and Chrysothamnus. Now, all species of rabbitbrush are late-season flowering shrubs. These shrubs bloom from August to October, and as you can imagine, when they're blooming, there's really not much else that's blooming at this time of the year. Because of their late blooming habits and because they grow in very arid environments, they tend to support a pretty high diversity of bees. In fact, there's been over 140 species associated with this plant or found in connection with this plant in various databases. Again, like I said, this is primarily a dry habitat plant, and so as you can imagine, it occurs mostly on the eastern half of the state. There are tons of different subspecies of rabbitbrush though, and so some of them grow in western Oregon. While there are tons of subspecies, there's only 3 main species that grow in Oregon. Since there are so many subspecies though, it's important to try and source this plant locally when you can with a local nursery that knows what kind of subspecies to look for and to grow in a particular region. Rabbitbrush is the last plant that we'll talk about, but before we go, I want to give some final conclusions and considerations when considering plants like shrubs and trees for bees. So first, we know that shrubs and trees are diverse, and using diverse shrubs and trees can provide forage and nesting resources for a very diverse group of bees. Another important consideration to make when choosing shrubs and trees is to make sure that you match the growth requirements of the shrubs and trees that you're interested in with your local site conditions. This is important to ensure that you successfully are able to establish your shrub and tree plants and make sure that they don't die when you try and plant them. We also know that shrubs and trees can provide a dense floral resource for bees that's hard to match with other plants like forbs. But other plants like forbs are of course still important to consider and to use in your plantings. Overall, there's many reasons to consider shrubs and trees, and I just went over a few of them in this presentation, but there is some other material on Canvas that I put together, so please make sure to look through that. There's both a range map that includes lists of plants for different regions of the state, and there's also a planting guide that includes some information about all of the different types or taxa of shrubs and trees that we have in the state. Thank you for listening, and I hope you found this presentation useful.